Stage 5 load shedding, of course, one of those trending topics, and couple that with the heavy rains and thunderstorms that were wreaking havoc in parts of Gauteng in the past few days. Really a recipe for disaster. Some homes, major roads and low-lying areas flooded over the weekend and over the past few weeks, you could say. The country also witnessing deadly floods in the Eastern Cape and in KwaZulu-Natal this year. So this morning we're asking, could climate change be behind these adverse weather patterns? Let's bring in Professor Francois Engelbrecht, who is the Director of Global Change Institute at the University of Witwatersrand. He joins us via our video link this morning. Prof, great to have you with us on the program. And as we, as residents here in Gauteng and other parts of the country as well, try to come to terms with the kind of weather we've been experiencing over the past couple of weeks, who do we blame? Is it climate change, or is it the fact that we've got such poor infrastructure that we feel the weather even more?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Yes, climate change is certainly playing a role in what we've been experiencing all of 2022 in terms of flooding. Let me first point out that we are currently in a so-called natural La Nina phase. So we are now experiencing the third consecutive La Nina season globally. And for South Africa, this almost always means above normal rainfall and from time to time flooding. Now, the fact that it's the third La Nina season in a row is already quite exceptional. That has only happened 3 times since 1950. And there's some preliminary signs indicating that in a warming world, these La Nina events will indeed occur more frequently. But our climate change is more directly impacting on the heavy falls of rain we've been experiencing, and probably also the role climate change played during the last week, is that the warmer we are making the atmosphere, very simply, the more water vapor we can keep within the atmosphere, and the more rainfall can eventually be produced by storm systems. The warmer atmosphere also very simply means there's more energy for the atmosphere to generate intense storm systems. So across the entire world, we are observing that intense storms are occurring more frequently. Now, South Africa is no exception. If we look at the data collected by our weather stations over the last 6 decades, we can see a clear trend that over the eastern parts of South Africa, intense rainfall events, that the type of rainfall events that can cause flooding, these types of rainfall events are occurring more frequently, and we can expect a further systematic increase in such events already over the next decade and the next 2 decades. Now, that brings us to the final important point you've made. What about the living conditions of our people in South Africa? And we have to acknowledge, we have hundreds of thousands of people living below flood lines all across South Africa. Our cities continue to grow in an informal way. And for as long as this is going to be the case, for as long, for example, as we have in KwaZulu-Natal, people living below the flood lines of mighty rivers such as the Umgeni, or for as long as people live along steep hill slopes where mudslides can occur, the hard reality is that these types of events will continue to have a high impact in South Africa, and we unfortunately will continue to see people losing their lives in these flash flood events.
I mean, given what you've just said now, Prof, you know, do our experts, or should our experts have enough information to predict these kind of La Nina events? I mean, is there a way for us to better prepare our communities, especially those who are the most at risk?
Yes, the first step is, of course, having reliable early warning systems in place that can give our disaster risk managers the opportunity to take action and help communities to remove themselves out of the way of harm during a flood event. Now, the scientific component of this, the actual weather predictions, that's only one part of an early warning system. I would say that generally, early warning systems in South Africa, specifically those managed by the Weather Service, are working well. There are exceptions. For example, during the recent KwaZulu-Natal floods, I think the strongest or the highest level of warming was issued too late when the event was already happening. But in general, the Weather Service is doing a good job, and they provide us with accurate early warnings at short-range timescales, so telling us that in the next 24 hours or in the next 48 hours, we can expect heavy falls of rain in a certain part of the country. That generally works well. The seasonal forecasts are really good in indicating when we can expect a season of above normal La Nina type rainfall. So this past year, we already had warnings as early as August that the La Nina season was upon us. Maybe the more important aspect where we need to focus is how do we communicate these early warnings to our most vulnerable communities. So what we need in South Africa are so-called community-based early warning systems. There must be such good trust between community leaders and the disaster risk reduction branches in the various provinces or in municipalities, that communities will have the confidence to evacuate when they are being told that a flood is imminent. That's something we have not yet really learned in South Africa. We are not accustomed in South Africa to evacuate thousands of people 1 or 2 days ahead of an event from where people are living in a vulnerable area. If we had such systems in place, we could have saved much more lives. In KwaZulu-Natal earlier this year, there was one community where such a system was in place, and hundreds of lives were saved in the KwaZulu-Natal floods or the Durban floods. But we could have saved many more lives if we have such systems, proper, widespread, scaled up, community-based early warning systems in place across South Africa.
I mean, Prof, do you reckon that, given how you see the weather patterns shifting year on year, that we will need to get those kinds of systems in place sooner rather than later?
Absolutely. Climate science tells us that these types of events are only going to occur more frequently, and they are going to become more intense. So we need to prepare along 2 different fronts, I would say. The first is having these community-based early warning systems in place, specifically to manage flood events. I think increasingly also to manage heat wave events. But we also need to look at a longer term. We should not accept that we need to have hundreds of thousands of people being so vulnerable forever. Of course, we need to try and completely change the situation of these communities and make them much more resilient. So what we also need is to execute on South Africa's really excellent national adaptation strategy. Science have been talking to the Department of Forestry and Fisheries and the Environment for many years, and as a consequence of that interaction between science and policy, we have a really good national adaptation strategy in South Africa. But it needs to be implemented at a municipal scale. For example, we must tackle this very, very tough challenge of helping the most vulnerable communities to move to safer land. Now, we all know as South Africans that's not easy. It's not easy to convince people to relocate to a different location. People must be convinced that they will have at that new location clean water, transport to the city to compete for jobs. Their safety must be guaranteed. You need a lot of money to relocate communities from below floodline areas to safer areas. And that's a challenge that we have to take on at scale in the country. Otherwise, we will just have the situation we have literally hundreds of thousands of people vulnerable during each summer when we have these above normal rainfall events and the associated flood.
Professor Francois Engelbrecht, let me thank you for your time this morning, sir.